Hey, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
I'm Brenda J.
And I'm Karen Wonder.
And we are HangingOnToHope.org.
This podcast is intended as educational and is not psychological or medical advice. Always consult a professional when needed, and we disclaim any liability in connection with the instruction, information, or advice given. Thanks for tuning into the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
Oh, hey, wait, Karen. All right. I decided to let you do this intro, even though we fought over the Gregoire's intro last time, because you had clearly communicated on that one podcast. Which one was that?
That was the one about the love and respect book. That it's not about genuine respect.
Karen communicated that her favorite topics were
my favorite three topics.
Her favorite three topics were the Bible, hope, and sex. We talked about you a little bit at the end, and I said, we're going to leave the sex podcast to the Gregoires.
They got that down.
I said, but we'll do one once in a while.
I'm sorry, hold on a second. Did you? Yes.
If the Bible, hope, and sex are her favorite topics. So I'm just going to let her go with it. And, let's go ahead. All right. I'm giving this one to her.
All right. She's letting me do the intro because of that. So let me do it again. Oh, my goodness. So welcome back to our podcast, Sheila Wray Gregoire.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So you've become known as the Christian sex lady, that you're an award-winning author, speaker, and host of the Bare Marriage podcast, which is a great podcast. We're going to be talking about your newest book, The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex. This podcast is for those who are married or who are wanting to be married, or in my case, hoping to be remarried someday. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yes, welcome to the show. This is Brenda J. Nice talking to you again. You share openly in your book that people can make certain impressions about someone that always speaks or writes about sex, but that you had to struggle, wrestle with God, and grow and learn. You say it's when we struggle, overcome obstacles, and then come out on the other side with a fuller picture of what God wants, when He often gives us something profound to say. How many years have you been married? And do you want to share a summary of your background?
Yeah, so I've been married. We hit our 30th anniversary in December, so that was exciting.
Wow. Congratulations!
Yes.
Yeah, it's been quite a while, and we got married so young, and we loved Jesus, but boy, did we ever not know what we were doing, and that's why I like to tell people. Everyone assumes that because I write about this stuff, sex has always been easy for me, but it hasn't. Like, this was the worst part of our marriage when we first got married. And we did have a lot to learn. And I do think it's been in the areas that we have the most difficult time, that God often works and teaches us the most, so that we have more to share. So yes, I just like people to realize I'm speaking out of experience and the trenches, and not just that this has always been easy for me.
Yeah. I just have to ask this. Have you heard of Jay Stringer? Have you read his book, Unwanted?
I haven't. It's on my list, but I know he's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I saw you're doing a thing on attachment theory, and he really brings that into play, which I find so interesting.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I'd like to get him on the podcast too.
You secretly read books without telling me, and then I find out on the podcast.
I read books all the time. I love
it from me.
It's my addiction. So I love how in the introduction you say, what if God meant it when He called Adam and Eve buck naked and not ashamed good in Genesis 1:31? And what if that pronouncement of good still echoes through the ages? You go on to share many things can mar that, like shame about your sexual past, abuse, etc. You say a good girl is not someone who has done everything right or who has never had anything bad happen to her. On the contrary, a good girl is someone who understands that sex is good because our God made it good and that her body is good. So our audience speaks to survivors of abuse or destructive marriages, or relationships. Some are still married, some are separated or divorced, and some are single again, and some are remarried. In any of those cases, it's important to understand that. I personally desire to be married again to a Christian man that's passionate about his faith. So for me, this book was hopeful that I can experience sex the way God meant it to be. So do you want to expound a little bit more on the specific audience for this latest book?
I was on the podcast earlier with you last year, I think, talking about our book, The Great Sex Rescue,
Yes.
which was the book that tore apart all the really serious toxic teaching that has been in the evangelical church around sex. And we looked at some of the very destructive books that have really hurt people. And I like to say, in the words of Ecclesiastes, that there's a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them together. And Great Sex Rescue was scattering stones. We were knocking down walls. We were punching holes in things.
Yeah,
definitely.
That was necessary.
Yes. And the Great Sex Rescue is like, we are building up again. We're gathering those stones together. We're building something healthy. And so, the Great Sex Rescue was very needed. I hope that The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex and its companion book, The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex, will just help younger people start well, so that maybe the Great Sex Rescue can be obsolete in 20 years because no one's getting the negative messages anymore.
Yes, I hope so.
Definitely.
I hope so.
Definitely. Well, in your book, The Great Sex Rescue, you shared your research of 20,000 women that a sexy body, or what the world calls sexy, was not an indicator of great sex, that a great marriage was. It's more about being loving and feeling truly valued and accepted. Can you share a little more on that?
Yeah, I think that we have this idea that sexy is really about what you look like. It's about how adventurous you are. It's about how willing you are to throw caution to the wind and just, become this sort of animal being. And that's not really the way God made us. He made us, yes, with a strong sex drive. And for many of us, that sex drive has been artificially lowered or eradicated for all kinds of very sad but reasonable reasons. So he did make us with a sex drive, but that sex drive isn't for animalistic sex. It's for a deep, meaningful connection. And that connection is lived out, hopefully in a passionate way in marriage. But it isn't just about your body. It is about being truly vulnerable with one another, being able to experience something amazing with one another. And that's the key. It isn't just being super sexy and adventurous and wearing some French maid costume. It's being able to really be vulnerable with one another.
Yes, I agree. And many of us are given a shameful view of sex. You say in your book, parents throughout history and across cultures, instead of teaching girls that sex is truly a beautiful gift they were meant to enjoy, have tended to keep sex a shameful secret, not naming it nor talking about it, and hoping their daughters would never be curious about it. And that was certainly my experience when I look back. I remember when curious, I don't remember how I asked it, but I asked my mom something about it. And so she's like, oh, let me go find that book. And so she's like looking for this book. And she never found it. So she never, told me anything about it. So of course I was still curious. So I remember my neighbor, Angie, I remember in her backyard, we went in her shed, in her backyard, and she told me all about what it was. I was like, what? My mom and dad do that.
How old were you?
I don't remember how old I was, but I was pretty young. I mean, obviously, I don't know.
My mom never told me anything.
Yeah.
I had absolutely no clue.
Yeah. And that's what she says, is that it's not talked about. So when we raised our boys, we tried to talk about it early. And unfortunately, I feel like we erred in the other direction where, well, not really the other direction, but we used purity culture language and the materials that we used, which were really popular at the time. I look back and I think they were not any less shameful. And the terms that they used, like I remember them talking about things. I'm like, that's just such shameful language. So how is shame detrimental to healthy sex?
I just want to encourage parents that even if you don't do things perfectly, your kids can still develop a very healthy view of sexuality as long as you're just able to keep the lines of communication open. I mean, when my oldest daughter, Rebecca, who was actually one of the co-authors of The Great Sex Rescue, and she's on our Bare Marriage podcast all the time. We talk about sex all the time. She's great. Okay. But when she was 10, I took her on a Passport to Purity weekend. I used the Family Life Passport to Purity curriculum.
We did that too.
And it was like, okay, so you explain through listening to CDs, they learn what their period is, what puberty is, what sex is. And then in the next breath, there's all of these exercises you're supposed to do with them to teach them about soul ties and how if they have sex before marriage, they will be tied to this other person. They won't be able to enjoy sex. And so they need to promise to not have sex until marriage. I could have gotten her to promise to never talk to a boy again. She was so grossed out at that point in her, she's just learned what sex is. She's absolutely disgusted and like weirded out. And now they want you to manipulate her to say that she won't have sex. I just felt that it was very inappropriate. And so we didn't do a lot of those exercises. And
my ex did all those because we had boys, and they teach, that the dad talks with the boys and the mom talks with the girls.
That's exactly what happened in my family too.
Yeah.
With my kids.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't do a great job with my younger daughter either, but as they got older, we just kept talking about it and they thought I was cool to talk to and it all worked out fine. And so I just want to tell parents, you don't need to do it perfectly to have things end up okay. In fact, the girls used to laugh at me about how bad a job I did. And so I got upset at them one day and I said, well, why don't you guys do a better one? Like, do you think you really could do it better? And they said they could. So they created the puberty course that I sell on my site now. It's called The Whole Story. They did it when they were 20 and 22. And there's videos of them telling girls what sex and puberty and tampons are. And it's really quite a great course. We have a boys version of it now too.
That's for adolescent boys. Not for
that's much healthier than what I used with my kids. But yeah, you don't need to be perfect. You just need to be available. And that's the big thing. Unfortunately, what we often do is we're scared to talk about things because we feel like if I talk about them, they'll do them. Mm-hmm. Or if they know about this, then they're no longer innocent. We surveyed 20,000 women for the Great Sex Rescue. And then we surveyed another 8,000 women for a book that's coming out next year, our mother-daughter book. And in that book, we just finished the edits on it. So I'm thinking about it a lot right now. But we asked women, what words did you know at the end of high school? And we presented them with quite the list. Women were more likely to know the words for male anatomy than they were for female anatomy. So they were more likely to know scrotum, for instance, than vulva or clitoris. So it's like, wow. We're telling them the words for guys, or they learn it in media or whatever, but they don't know the words for their own body. And that's scary.
Yeah, it is.
Just basic information. Yeah.
Yeah. And we also found the more words kids knew and the more they knew about sex ed, they actually acted out less. They made wiser decisions. And so it's not like education makes your kids sexual. Education helps your kids make good decisions. It makes it less likely that they'll be sexually abused. There's all kinds of good reasons. And so we need to start talking to our kids, because when kids don't have words for things, whatever we can't name causes shame.
Yes.
And that's where a lot of our shame comes from, is because we feel like I'm not allowed to talk about this part of me.
Yeah. And it's good that we're putting this on a podcast against abuse, because being in an abusive marriage, you're so controlled that by the time my kids became teenagers, just kind of like what Karen just said, my ex was like, I'm going to talk, I'm going to be the one that you don't know what you're doing. I'm going to be the one to talk to them about this. So then I was never open to it because I just did whatever he said. And now I'm regretting that. So I hope anybody that's listening will be, make sure that exactly what you just talked about, being open.
Yeah.
Whether you do a perfect job or not, because I had to just do whatever he said. Mm-hmm. So this is really good to cover this. And then also just what I was going to mention too, is being in an abusive relationship for 22 years. I feel like I'm starting over. Like maybe I need to relearn everything. I'm not in a relationship right now, but I feel like I never had any example of healthy whatsoever. So right. I probably need to start looking at your books and listening to your podcasts and everything. And it's like I'm starting over almost, so I can figure out what healthy is.
That's something that actually really surprised us with Great Sex Rescue and with the newer books, is we didn't realize how many women coming out of abusive relationships would read them. We were picturing them more for women in marriages. We didn't realize how many men would read them either. We're actually quite blown away by how many guys are reading them. But I just think that God is doing such a big work in the church right now, calling us towards health and wholeness.
Yes.
And people just need to know that there is a message out there that isn't shame-filled.
Yes.
That we can feel like, I was made good, and all of the stuff that happened to me, it wasn't my fault. And even though I was raised to think I was causing other people to sin, that wasn't on me. And I think it's just amazing how so many people are giving that same message and so many people are finding freedom right now. I think God's doing something amazing. It's really cool.
I think so too.
It
I
is
love
awesome.
That makes us encouraged.
Well, the way we as women feel about our bodies can detrimentally affect our sex lives. You say to think about your body is to be reminded that you're not good enough. You haven't exercised lately. You ate a whole bag of chips last night. You had ice cream for breakfast, not to mention how we constantly see images of what the ideal body is to compare ours to. How can women overcome these issues in the bedroom? And I know I definitely struggle. I think we all struggle with this.
Yeah, definitely.
It's very hard to think about your body without judging yourself, isn't it?
Right. Oh my goodness. Yes.
Like, I don't think there's any other part of our relationship or any other part of our lives or self-esteem or identity or whatever you want to call it, that is as judgment focused as our bodies.
Yeah.
And so I think what happens for so many women is that the body causes so much shame that we kind of stop feeling. Like anything below the neck, we just don't pay attention to.
Yeah,
because if you pay attention to it, you're only going to feel bad.
Right.
But what happens when you don't pay attention to your body? You may not get medical help for stuff that actually matters.
Yeah. You get disconnected.
Right? Exactly. And when we get disconnected from our bodies, we don't treat our bodies well. Ironically, we can actually make some of these issues worse. One of the keys, for instance, to health is learning how to listen to your body and figure out what your body actually is craving right now. Because even though you might think you're craving chips, your body may actually just want to eat something healthy, or you might need some protein, or, maybe you just need 2 glasses of water because you're seriously dehydrated. But we don't know how to listen to our bodies. And that shows up in the bedroom. It also shows up in other areas of our lives, though. But when we don't listen to our bodies, it's really hard to get turned on, to get aroused, to have a libido, anything. Because there's a concept called mindfulness. And some people also call it embodiment when it comes to sex. It's kind of a similar thing, which is when you pay attention to just what you're experiencing without judging anything. You're just experiencing. And embodiment is when we're really experiencing through our bodies. And that's what great sex is you're not worried about what you look like. You're not worried about what you sound like. You're not worried about whether you're doing it right. You're just experiencing and you're letting your body carry you along. And that is the key to pleasure, which a lot of women have never really figured out for good reason, again. But so much of this is based in our body shame that we can't think of ourselves from the neck down. And often that's because of past trauma. Sometimes it's because of body image issues. Sometimes it's just because we trained ourselves to turn off our sex drive because we thought we had to be the gatekeepers, because if we don't stop it, he sure can't. And so we have to be the gatekeepers. And that's very difficult to turn off once you're married too.
Yeah. Well, it also doesn't help either when you're verbally abused and they're criticizing your body. That's so hard to get past because most of the time it's lies and you can get past it. But, that's part of verbal abuse too.
Yeah, those go deep.
Yeah, that happens.
And it's also a big red flag for porn use. I mean, it's not always porn use, but if he's starting to criticize your body, that's a big red flag.
Yeah, because there's some deal with that
right
measure up to.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of church cultures and Christian marriage book messages, which we talked about on our other podcast with you, basically imply that sex is mostly for men, with women's pleasure as an afterthought. But we know God made the women's body part specifically for pleasure. It's not multi-purpose like the man's part. And I came across this article and I thought it was so funny because it was saying it was a secular article, but it was saying that scientists are puzzled why a woman has an orgasm because it's not needed for reproduction. And when I read the article, I just laughed. I'm like, well, because maybe God wanted the woman to have pleasure. Hello? It just cracked me up. So I think it's prevalent in secular culture and definitely in the Christian marriage books that I read a lot of. So you say that we need to define what having sex means. Can you expound on that?
Yeah. So when we normally think she had sex last night, what we think we're saying is something about penis and vagina, move around, he climaxed. Like what we're picturing is intercourse. The problem with that definition of sex is that she's basically left out of the picture. All she has to be doing is show up. So she could be lying there making a grocery list in her head. She could be in emotional turmoil. She could even be being coerced, and it would still count as having sex. And that's not what God ever meant. When we talk about how sex is an important part of marriage and how it's sacred and how it bonds us, intercourse alone does not bond you. Intercourse alone can actually make you feel very distant. Now, that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with intercourse. I'm just saying intercourse, when it's not combined with a healthy marriage and with mutuality and all of these other good things, it doesn't bond you.
Right.
Absolutely.
It can actually be very empty.
Yes.
And so from scripture, we see this odd verse in Genesis 4, verse 1, Adam knew his wife Eve and they conceived a son. God's telling us sex is supposed to be this deep knowing of one another. It's supposed to be intimate. And we know from Song of Solomon that it's pleasurable for both. She says even more words than he does in that book. So she's having a good time. And then in 1 Corinthians 7, it's supposed to be completely mutual. And I think learning that message, that is what God meant for women, for it to be intimate, mutual, and pleasurable for both, can be so healing for women coming out of destructive marriages. Because if you've been in a marriage where sex has been coerced, where you have felt objectified, it can almost feel like God was your pimp. Because you feel like God was telling you, you have to do this. He needs this. This is your job.
Right.
And so you don't matter. And understanding that, no, wait, that was never the way it was supposed to be.
Right.
That can actually be a very healing thing, I think.
Yeah. And that's why I think it's important to talk about, because again, to me, it's like God gets misrepresented in that message.
That just touched something so profoundly in me right there, what you just said, because I did not feel like I mattered at all in that marriage. At all.
Yeah.
That just hit me hard.
Well, and I think as women, we can't, I think men are easier to decompartmentalize, like if you're having problems in the marriage, their sex life doesn't matter. But as women, that's a lot more difficult. And I think that's where a lot of the pain comes in abusive relationships or destructive relationships, is we can't decompartmentalize if we're having problems and issues. I mean, plus it just overall, it just affects the women, in a deeper level. So it's more of a emotional, painful thing.
Yeah. And it's not that I feel like I didn't matter. I actually didn't matter. That's what makes it hard.
Yeah.
Can
I just comment on that compartmentalization thing too?
Sure.
Yeah.
There's a misconception that men are able to compartmentalize better than women. That's not actually the case. When they've done a lot of studies, what they find is that women and men are both equally bad at multitasking. It's just that women have more practice at it because we have to do it.
Yeah.
And so the reason that women are less compartmentalized is because we have to be. Okay.
Right.
Because we're looking after the kids. We've got to get the laundry on while the dinner's on. And we have to remember that so-and-so needs their homework done. And all of this stuff is on our shoulders, right? But then what also happens is we have so many, and this happens to men especially. It's not only men, because women can have this happen too. But where boys, when they're little, are not really given words or the ability to talk through or identify their emotions. And so the only emotions they're allowed to have are happy or angry. And they don't know how to feel when it's sad or when it's rejected or when it's fearful. That really bothers them because they can't process that emotion because they were never taught. And so what men often do is they channel their emotions into sex.
That's interesting.
Because sex allows them to feel connected without having to do the work of connecting.
Very interesting.
Because in order to truly connect, you have to become vulnerable.
Yeah.
Right.
In order to become vulnerable, you have to get in touch with your emotions.
Right.
And that's something that many men, especially with, avoidant attachment styles or with some with abuse in their past or whatever it might be, just aren't able or willing to do. And so we get into these marriages where he basically is using her and she feels used.
Yeah.
And it's easy for us to talk about, well, that's just the way men are. But no, it's not. Like that was never God's design either.
Wow, that's encouraging.
That, that again is how these things have gotten perpetuated through really dysfunctional ways of raising kids, through dysfunctional ways of relating to one another. And the good news is I think we can break that cycle in future generations if we start to get this right.
Yes.
That's great.
That's why your work is important.
Yeah, because I always thought that that's just how men were.
Right.
So now you just kind of corrected us on that.
Out of the
That's
water.
Wonderful.
I did too. And then my daughter, who's a psych grad, started getting mad at me when I was saying that on my podcast. And she's like, that's not true, Mom, right? And I'm like, of course it is. She's like, no, it's not. And then she started showing me all these studies. And I'm like, oh, okay.
Oh, I like that, though.
It gives me hope. I know. It really does.
Definitely more hopeful outlook.
It really, really gives me much more hope because I had given up before this podcast. I had given up.
You just gave Brenda a new life.
I had given up completely. But anyway, now I haven't. You are awesome. Okay. One aspect of women enjoying sex with her husband is the wife allowing herself to be served. You say they have to stop always thinking about everyone else and concentrate and allow themselves to be served, and that expressing love during sex is the key to women's sexual response. Why is that so important?
Yeah, this is kind of a funny thing. Okay. Think about where God put the clitoris.
To be continued. Stay tuned for next week's part 2 with Sheila Wray Gregoire. You don't want to miss it.
Thanks for tuning in to Hanging On to Hope. Check out our website, hangingontohope.org. There are resources on there, and if you would like to donate or volunteer, you can do that through our website. We are a brand new nonprofit, so we appreciate any and all support. And we thank you for listening, and until next time, keep hanging on to hope. We are evidence that there is hope and healing for you, and our passion is to help you find it too. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening, everyone.